Babysitters. Was there a time you had to call the police on the parents of the child you babysat? So, what happened? Story 1. I didn't call the police, but I came very close. Namely, there was a little boy that I babysat for as a teenager, every Friday of every other week, as no one could handle him. His grandma once showed up at a restaurant and gave him back to his parents when she watched him. He was always pretty good to me, mainly because I would let him marathon Bob the Builder. Anyway, one night I'm making his macaroni and cheese, and he's playing in the living room. His parents had been gone a couple of hours, and it had just gotten dark out. I had put the water on the stovetop, and Andy was narrating his game for me from the living room when suddenly a door in the kitchen opened, and a man I had never seen before walked out of the basement and into the kitchen. He was dirty, had scraggly hair, and was freaky skinny, so I immediately screamed and threw the not yet hot water at him. Then he started screaming and yelling that he was Andy's uncle, and he lived in the basement. Additionally, he stormed back into the basement, and I called the boy's parents, who told me that the man was, in fact, the dad's brother, who had just been released from prison and was living in the basement. They hadn't felt comfortable leaving him alone with their 3-year-old, as he had been convicted of violent crimes. So they thought it would be better if I, a skinny 15-year-old girl, was there as an intermediary. I called my dad, who came and spent the next 5 hours with me until they got home. I'm not sure about the conversation they had while I was waiting in the car, but I didn't babysit for them again for a long time. Story 2. I called family services, if that counts, when I started babysitting for a newly single mother, so things were understandably, at the time anyway, a total mess. Bare mattresses on the floor, clothes in piles, no food in the cupboards, and the only furniture was a couch and her bed. At first, I was sympathetic. I only watched her kids for her to work as a server in the evenings, and she expressed how hard she was trying to get her life together, but nothing changed at all as the weeks went by. Then she started coming in way later than when I knew the restaurant was closed, visibly messed up on drugs and alcohol. She stumbled in the wee hours of the morning, vomiting completely out of her head, showing off a fresh tattoo, while earlier that same evening, I had genuinely struggled to find enough food to satisfy all 3 kids. I was so sad and overwhelmed. She was paying me so well, but I realized even at 17 years old, that was called hush money. I ran into the kids in a grocery a few years later with their dad and grandma, where they told me they had been living since they last saw me. They gave me hugs and looked so happy and healthy. No one but my mom ever knew about my involvement. It's heartbreaking to hear about the challenging conditions those children were living in when you started babysitting for them. It's understandable that you initially felt sympathetic toward the mother, but as her behavior deteriorated, it became clear that the children were not in a safe environment. You made a brave and responsible decision by calling family services, even at a young age, and putting the children's well-being first. Story 3. Not the cops, but an ambulance. My husband's cousin had just moved into an apartment down the road from me with 2 kids, both of daycare age. One morning she called me and asked if I could watch the little baby boy. She then proceeded to tell me the older one would be going to today's care, but the baby had a bit of a cold and daycare wouldn't allow him there. I said sure 10 minutes later, and she showed up with him. By the way, he was sleeping at the time. She told me he had just eaten and would sleep for a bit, and I was fine with that. She left immediately after no meds and no directions. I had a 1.5-year-old one at my disposal, so I had supplies. Once, I felt his head and he was hot, so I took his temp and it was high, way higher than it should be. So I called her work, before cell phones, and I got her on the phone and proceeded to tell her this baby is sick, very sick. He needs to go to the room, but she refused. So I called our grandmother and told her what was going on and called her dad. The whole time, this baby hasn't moved, and I am starting to panic. My uncle told me to call the hospital and call an ambulance. Uncle called mom and finally got her to acknowledge how sick he was. He was in intensive care for almost a month and almost passed away. Because of the lack of oxygen, he has learning disabilities and pretty much will never be on his own. His mother blamed vaccines. Because of the situation, cops then had to do a wellness check on my home. I will never forgive her for what she did to that baby and how he could have lost his life in my care. Story 4. I didn't exactly call the police myself, but I was once babysitting for a single mom who had a 3 or 4-year-old. She was at a strange stage of life, but was essentially house sharing a council estate type house with a single dad. They weren't involved together, just housemates. He had 2 kids as well, 6 and 8 approximately. This guy was around while I babysat because I guess they had an agreement that they didn't look after each other's kids. He was nice and offered me food, although I'm pretty sure he was a bit of an alcoholic. At about 10 p.m., the mom of the 2 kids turned up, off her head drunk or high, and just starts to scream and shout at the dad. She's ranting and raving about something or other and hitting him, acting like an actual maniac. She was completely crazy. So I just grabbed the 2 kids that I wasn't babysitting and took them into the room with the girl I am babysitting to shelter. The mom keeps at it for a while until the dad eventually manages to shut her in a room and calls the police, who came and dealt with it. I gave a statement, and that was that. It was really sad because the 2 little kids acted as if it was no big deal, and they were used to it. I was pretty horrified and didn't go back. Reply 1. It was really sad because the 2 little kids acted as if it was no big deal and they were used to it. Reading this sentence was like being punched in the gut. I grew up with an alcoholic father. He would come home drunk and my parents would fight. My oldest sister would drag me and my brother to her room to distract us. And when she was old enough to drive, she would throw us in her car and drive us to one of her friends' houses to wait it out. But to us, it was normal. We were so used to the fighting that we didn't really react to it. When we heard the shouting and then our sister calling for us, we just went with her without question. Story 5. I had to call 911 while I was being babysat by my grandma as a kid because she had a stroke. I recognized the symptoms from the Babysitters Club. Fortunately, she made a full recovery and is still doing fine almost 20 years later. Story 6. Caught the lady blowing meth into her 21-month-old daughter's face. I exclaimed, "What the hell are you doing?" And she said she didn't want her to grow fat. Story 7. Don't know if this counts, but I used to work at a summer camp when I was a teenager. About once a week, we would all walk down the street to the community outdoor pool. There were 2 girls, 5 and 8, who were very shy and stuck to themselves a lot. We only had them for about 3 days at this point. I tried to include them in games, but it was like they didn't see anyone around them and just lived in their own bubbles. One day when we were getting ready to go to the pool, I was helping some of the younger kids put sunscreen on their backs. I remember asking the younger girl if I could help her, and she nodded. When I lifted up the back of her shirt to get her shoulders, she was absolutely covered in bruises and what I guess were cigarette burns. Every inch of her back. It was the most horrifying thing I'd seen at that point in my life. I was 16 myself, so I went to my boss and showed her the girl's back, and her older sister was exactly the same. We ended up calling the police, and they came and got the girls that afternoon. The shape of the bruises almost looked like whip marks, like they were whipped with a belt until they left insane bruises, which was so sad. I never saw those girls again. Reply 1. As an adult who is into impact play, I can attest to just how hard you'd have to hit someone with a belt for it to bruise. I'd say a belt wasn't the implement used, and it might have been something more like a switch. They cut and bruise like nothing else. Story 8. My son, who was 10 at the time, had a friend who was 8 then. I asked the boy's mom if it was fine to run to the store because it was a rural neighborhood, legally okay, with a lot of mature kids. And she agreed. My son calls me and says that I need to get home immediately since his friend had put on porn and wanted him to watch it. I told him I was on my way home and to tell his friend to turn it off. He said, "You don't understand, Mom. He told me that his dad does that stuff to him." My heart sank. I called the kid's mom and had her come to my house alone. I told her that I had to report it and asked whether she was going to move forward with it or not. So I reported it to the state, mandated reporter and obvious duty. The mom pressed charges, and now the bastard is in jail. I remind my kid how much of a hero he is. Sometimes he worries that he broke up a family, but knows he did the right thing. Yeah, the fact that your son was able to recognize that something was wrong and call you immediately shows how important it is to have open communication with our children. Your prompt action and decision to report the situation, regardless of the mother's choice, was the right thing to do. Story 9. I always watched this one family that had 3 kids, 11, 6, and 4. Anyway, one time I watched them and they were super excited because their dad was coming home. Military family. So we made signs and cookies to welcome him. I noticed the 11-year-old was quieter than usual, but his mother said he had started puberty and was a bit moody, so I let it go. Anyway, the next time I came was 2 days later because the parents wanted a date night. The mom said that the 11-year-old was in his room and wouldn't come out, and if I wanted to, I could try to get him to come out, but she was fine with him needing alone time. I went upstairs after a while to bring him a sandwich and saw him leaving the room. He had massive bruises on his cheek and on his arm. As soon as he saw me, he ran to his room, but I caught the door before he could close it. I questioned him, very gently, about the bruises, but he wouldn't give me a straight answer, just half-mumbled excuses. I immediately knew what was going on because I myself had been abused as a kid. When the parents came home, I told them what I saw, but they just laughed it off. I then said that I know what abuse looks like and that maybe they didn't know this was considered abuse. But the father got really defensive and even raised his hand to slap me, yelling about stupid and them being his kids. And what do I know? So I called the police, and after an investigation, it turned out that he was suffering from PTSD and hitting the 11-year-old as a coping mechanism. The mother refused to believe it and kept calling the kid and me liars. Eventually, the kids were sent to other family while the father went through therapy. As far as I know, the kids are all safe and happy now, thank God, and the father got through his PTSD and is now a stable man who runs a garage. Story 10. I didn't call the police, but this event was pretty freaky, and fortunately, everyone vulnerable got out of the situation before the police were needed. During my senior year of high school, my English teacher rented out his basement to a single mother and her autistic son, and he recommended me as a babysitter. It went well for a few weeks until my English teacher suddenly got weird. On one occasion, I was doing homework when a mouse ran across my foot and screamed. He rushed down into the basement to check on me, but then decided that was time to thoroughly check every crevice of the apartment. I thought he was just checking for mice or whatever. Cut to next week, suddenly he was privy to stuff that no one had told him. The mom came home one night and told me quietly she wanted to show me something, and revealed she had found a bug, like a microphone, in her stuff, and I was pretty shaken up because of it. So we put her son in his car seat, and I drove her to the bank, and she broke down crying in my car about how he was spying on her. I assured her I was 100% on her side because he had started some inappropriate behavior with me as well, fixing me nice dinners while he was helping me with my college essay, trying to ply me with wine, telling me his problems with his ex-wife and daughter. Then, the next week, she emailed him about something regarding a minor disagreement, and he forwarded it to me and a few of his friends, remember I'm 18 years old in this story, with some snarky commentary. I showed her the email immediately to inform her that her email communications weren't private. He tried to bitch me out that I had betrayed his trust or whatever, but one of the email recipients, another one of my teachers, agreed with my actions and supported informing the mom of what he had done. At that point, the mom and her son moved out to live with her mother until she could find something more permanent, and I no longer went to my English teacher's house for tutoring on my essay. It was my last semester at least, so I didn't have to deal with him much longer. I don't know what his end goal was, but I'm just glad I was there for that mom and witnessed the spying so he couldn't gaslight her in her vulnerable state. Story 11. The summer I was 17, I was recommended to babysit for this family with 2 young boys, 7 or 8 and 11 or 12. I showed up for my second day, like I did the day before, and the mom left to go to work. The younger boy was arguing with the older boy because he wanted to play on his iPhone. The older one was telling him that he couldn't play. I thought we were alone in the house. All of a sudden, an angry, large man walks down the stairs and starts yelling, "Hunter, give me your phone or I'm gonna whoop you." I didn't know that the dad was home. He came down without acknowledging me and whacked the younger boy so hard that I froze and thought he was going to hit me, but he just had that angry look in his eyes. The dad never once introduced himself to me, and no one ever told me that the dad would be home. I almost called CPS once. I ended up telling the boy's friend's mom to watch out for them and explained what happened. She said that she had never met the dad since he never comes home to the kids' soccer or baseball games. Well, this story highlights the importance of communication and transparency when it comes to childcare arrangements. It's quite concerning that neither the mother nor the father informed you that the dad would be home while you were babysitting. Witnessing the father's aggressive behavior towards the younger boy must have been distressing and alarming for you. Story 12. Our babysitter called the cops because my brother was trying to get us in terribly. He smashed a glass jar, cut himself up with the pieces, and almost lost an eye, slicing his eyelid open. The whole time just laughing his ass off about how we were going to be in so much trouble when Mom saw him. Story 13. The kid let it slip that the dad was sexually assaulting her. She was taken away from there, but I hope she is doing okay. Story 15. Not the cops, but my mom called CPS. I was 14 to 16, and a neighbor had asked if I could babysit her 3 kids overnight. Since I was young and it was a school night, my mom said no, but they talked for a while and ended up with a compromise. She would go out early and be home by 9. By the way, she never left a number to call as she didn't have a cell phone, as it was a low-income neighborhood just above community housing, and most families around didn't have any. Watching the kids was fine, as I knew them well, and I did some dishes and basic cleaning around the house. 9 p.m. came around, and no sign of her. An hour later, nothing, so around 11:30, I decided to call my mom as I was tired and unsure of what to do. She came to the house and sent me home and filled me in the next day. Apparently, around 4 in the morning, my mom was fed up and called CPS for abandoning her kids with a babysitter. She showed up at 9 the next morning with a random guy. She was a single mother with boyfriend. My mom just told her to never ask any of us to watch her kids again, and the lady just gave her $20 as my mom left. That was the price for about 19 hours of babysitting. Please leave your story down below in the comments. I would absolutely love to make a video about them in the future. And also don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, peace.